The church was packed. Champagne, laughter, and perfume thick enough to choke on, like this was her coronation, not a wedding. I stood in the second row, right where a place card with my name had been set, like a display tag on a museum exhibit of failure. My ex-wife leaned over, smiled, and said just loud enough for the people around us to hear, "You actually came. I thought you'd have the decency to be embarrassed." That's when the doors opened. A woman walked in, calm, expensive eyes that had already decided how this would end. And she walked straight toward me. Let me back up. Because that moment in the church, the place card, the perfume, the woman walking toward me, none of it makes sense unless you know how I got there. My name is Noah Parker. For 7 years I was married to Vanessa Cole. She was sharp, beautiful, and knew exactly how to make a room feel like it belonged to her. I'd loved that about her once. I loved how she could walk into a restaurant and make the hostess nervous. I loved how she remembered every name, every detail, every social advantage a conversation could offer. What I didn't love, what I learned too late, was that she kept score. Everything was a transaction. Every kindness had a price. And when I stopped being useful to her image, she started looking for someone who was. The divorce was clean on paper. No screaming matches in court. No drawn-out battles over assets. Just 2 lawyers, a stack of documents, and the quiet sound of 7 years collapsing into a manila envelope. I walked out of that courthouse with half of what I came in with, and a strange kind of relief I didn't expect. Vanessa walked out with a plan. She always had a plan. I rebuilt slowly. Got a stable job in logistics management. Nothing glamorous. Nothing that would land me on magazine covers. But it paid the bills, kept me disciplined, and gave me a reason to set an alarm every morning. I rented a decent apartment on the east side of town, started cooking my own meals, started running again. The kind of life that doesn't look impressive from the outside, but feels honest when you're living it. I wasn't wealthy. I wasn't broken either. I was just a man putting himself back together, one ordinary day at a time. Then about 14 months after the divorce, the invitation arrived. Thick, cream-colored envelope. Gold embossing. The kind of stationery that costs more per sheet than most people spend on lunch. Vanessa Cole and Grant Holloway request the honor of your presence. I almost laughed. Almost. Then I turned the card over and found a handwritten note on the back in Vanessa's unmistakable script. Come, so you can see what happiness actually looks like. That wasn't an invitation. That was a summons to my own humiliation. Grant Holloway. I knew the name before I ever saw it on that envelope. Real estate developer, mid-40s, the kind of man who wore success like cologne. Everywhere he went, you could smell it. His face showed up in local business journals every few months, always next to words like visionary and portfolio. He drove cars that cost more than my annual salary and treated every room he entered like a press conference. Vanessa hadn't just moved on. She had upgraded, or at least that's the story she wanted everyone to believe. I put the invitation on my kitchen counter and stared at it for 3 days. Every morning I'd pour my coffee, sit down, and look at that gold lettering like it was a riddle I couldn't solve. The smart move was obvious. Throw it away. Move on. Don't give her the satisfaction. My buddy Marcus told me exactly that when I made the mistake of mentioning it over beers. He leaned back in his chair and shook his head, like I'd told him I was thinking about swimming with sharks. She wants you there so she can stand on your neck in front of an audience, he said. Don't be the floor mat, Noah. He wasn't wrong, but something in me wouldn't let it go. It wasn't pride. Or maybe it was, but not the loud kind. Not the kind that makes you want to show up with a better car or a better story. It was the quiet kind, the kind that says, I'm not going to let someone rewrite who I am because I was too afraid to stand in the room. Vanessa had spent the last year telling anyone who would listen that I was the reason our marriage failed, that I lacked ambition, that I couldn't keep up with her. If I didn't show up, that story would grow legs. He didn't even have the nerve to face me, she'd say, and people would nod because absence always looks like guilt. So I decided to go, not to fight, not to prove anything, just to close the door on my own terms, standing up looking forward. That decision might have stayed simple if it weren't for Claire Whitmore. I met Claire 8 months before the wedding in a situation neither of us planned. I was grabbing dinner alone at a restaurant downtown, the kind of place that's nice enough to require a reservation, but not so nice that a guy like me feels out of place. She was sitting 2 tables over talking on the phone in a low voice that sounded like it was held together by willpower alone. When she hung up, she just sat there, staring at nothing, and I recognized that look. I'd worn it myself the night I signed my divorce papers. The look of someone watching something important fall apart in real time. I didn't say anything heroic. I didn't walk over with some smooth line. The waiter had mixed up our orders, and when I brought her plate to her table, she looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes and tried to smile. I said something simple. I don't even remember the exact words. Something like, "Whatever it is, it's not the end." She nodded. We ended up talking for about 40 minutes. She told me she was dealing with a business partner who had betrayed her trust and was trying to force her out of her own company. I told her I understood what it felt like to have someone you trusted turn the ground under your feet into quicksand. We didn't exchange life stories. We didn't become instant friends. But there was a recognition between us 2 people who knew what it meant to sit alone with a mess they didn't create. I helped her that night in a small way. She had locked her keys in her car, the kind of stupid human thing that happens when your mind is somewhere else entirely. I called a locksmith I knew waited with her until it was handled, and that was it. She thanked me, I said goodnight, and we went our separate ways. I didn't know she was worth millions. I didn't know she ran a company that had been featured in Forbes. To me, she was just a woman having a terrible night who needed someone to stand next to her for a little while. We exchanged numbers, but barely texted. A message here, a check-in there. Nothing romantic, nothing strategic. Just the quiet thread of 2 people who had shared an honest moment and hadn't forgotten it. So when Claire called me out of the blue 2 weeks before Vanessa's wedding, I wasn't expecting anything. She asked how I was doing. I told her the truth, mostly fine, except for the fact that my ex-wife had invited me to her wedding, like a hunter inviting a deer to the trophy room. Claire was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. Then she said something I didn't see coming. "If you want to walk in there with your head up, I'll go with you." I told her she didn't have to do that. I told her it wasn't her problem. I told her it would probably be awkward and uncomfortable and not worth her time. She listened to all of it, and then she said, "Noah, you stood with me on the worst night of my year, and you didn't ask for a single thing in return. Let me stand with you on yours." I didn't say yes right away. I sat with it for 2 days, turning the idea over like a coin in my pocket. Part of me felt like bringing Claire would look like a stunt, like I was showing up with a prop to prove something. But the other part of me, the honest part, knew the truth. I didn't want to walk into that church alone. Not because I was weak. Because walking into a room designed to break you is easier when someone believes you deserve to be standing. I called her back on a Wednesday evening. "Okay," I said. "But I'm not using you as a shield." Claire's voice was calm, almost amused. "Good. Because I'm not a shield. I'm just someone who knows what you're worth, even if the people in that room don't." That Saturday, I put on my best suit, a navy blue one I'd bought for a job interview 2 years ago. I looked in the mirror and saw a man who was scared, but still standing. And that was enough. I drove to the church alone. Claire said she'd meet me there. The church was old stone and stained glass, the kind of venue that whispers money before you even step inside. I pulled into the parking lot 20 minutes early because I wanted to get settled before the crowd thickened, but the lot was already half full of black sedans and polished SUVs that gleamed under the afternoon sun like a luxury dealership. I sat in my car for a minute, hands on the steering wheel, watching couples in tailored suits and silk dresses drift toward the entrance like they were walking a red carpet. My navy blue suit suddenly felt like a costume. I checked my phone. No message from Claire. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I came here for me, not for an entrance. And that was true. But somewhere between the driver's seat and the church steps, a thought crept in that I couldn't shake. What if people saw Claire and assumed the worst? What if they thought I had brought some woman here to make a scene, to rub something in Vanessa's face that wasn't who I was? I wanted to walk in, sit down, get through it, and leave with my dignity intact. Anything beyond that felt dangerous. The foyer smelled like white lilies and old wood. An usher in a charcoal vest pointed me toward the second row on the left side. Second row. Not the back, not the balcony, the second row. Close enough to see every expression on Vanessa's face during the vows. Close enough for her to see mine. I knew immediately that this wasn't an accident. Vanessa had arranged the seating herself, and she had put me right where the audience could watch me watching her win. I found my seat. There, it was a cream-colored place card with my name, written in the same elegant script as the invitation. Noah Parker, like a label on a jar at a museum. The couple next to me glanced over with the kind of polite curiosity that tells you they already know the story, or at least the version Vanessa told them. The church filled quickly. Laughter bounced off the stone walls. Glasses of champagne circulated on silver trays even before the ceremony started. Grant's idea, probably because everything about this event was designed to impress. The flowers were imported. The string quartet was playing something classical that I couldn't name, but that sounded expensive. Even the programs were printed on paper so thick it felt like fabric. This wasn't a wedding. This was a production, and Grant Holloway was the executive producer. I kept my eyes forward, my hands on my knees, my face neutral. I was doing fine. Then Vanessa appeared at the end of the aisle in a cloud of white silk and satisfaction. She wasn't walking toward the altar yet, just greeting guests near the front, doing her rounds like a politician at a fundraiser. She worked the room with a precision I recognized from our marriage. A touch on the arm here, a laugh there, a compliment delivered like a gift that came with strings. And then she found me. She leaned in close enough that I could smell her perfume, the same one she wore on our first date, which I was certain was deliberate. Her smile was flawless, and her voice carried just far enough for the people nearby to catch every word. Noah, I honestly didn't think you'd show. She tilted her head, the sympathy so perfectly performed it could have won an award. That's brave of you. Really. It wasn't a compliment. It was a dissection done with a smile, and the few people within earshot chuckled the way people do when they're not sure if something is funny or cruel, but don't want to be the one who doesn't laugh. I looked at her and felt something settle in my chest. Not anger, not humiliation, but a kind of resigned clarity. She hadn't changed. She was still performing, still keeping score. And I was still a line item on her ledger. I didn't respond, not because I didn't have words, but because the words I had weren't meant for an audience. She waited a beat, expecting something. A flinch, a stammer, maybe even a retreat toward the exit. When none of that came, a flicker of irritation crossed her face, before the smile snapped back into place, and she moved on to the next guest. The ceremony was 10 minutes from starting, when I heard the doors open behind me. I didn't turn around at first. People had been coming and going for the last half hour, and I had trained myself to stop looking every time the hinges creaked. But something shifted in the room, a quiet change in the air that I can only describe as a tension redirecting itself. The murmur of conversation didn't stop, but it thinned the way noise drops when something unexpected enters a space. I turned. Claire Whitmore stood in the doorway. She wore a dark emerald dress that fit like it had been designed specifically for her body, which it probably had. Her hair was pulled back, simple, nothing overdone. She carried no clutch, no bouquet, no unnecessary accessories, just herself, standing in the frame of that heavy oak door, like she had arrived not to impress anyone, but to simply be present. There was nothing loud about her, and that's exactly what made every head turn. She scanned the room with the unhurried calm of someone who had walked into 1,000 rooms and never once worried about whether she belonged. Her eyes found me in the second row, and she walked straight toward me without hesitation. "Sorry I'm late," she said, settling into the empty seat beside me, as naturally as if we had done this 100 times. "Traffic on the bridge was terrible." She said it with a small, easy smile that was meant only for me, and that simplicity was more disarming than any grand entrance could have been. I felt the room recalibrate. The couple next to me exchanged a glance. 2 women across the aisle leaned toward each other and whispered. The eyes that had been watching me with pity or amusement 10 minutes ago were now watching me with something else entirely: curiosity. Maybe confusion. Who was this woman? And why was she sitting next to the ex-husband like it was the most natural thing in the world? Near the front of the church, I saw Vanessa notice. She was mid-conversation with a bridesmaid, but her gaze snagged on Claire like a thread catching on a nail. Her smile didn't drop. Vanessa was too skilled for that, but something behind it shifted. A recalculation. I could almost see the gears turning. This wasn't in the script. The ceremony began. Grant stood at the altar, looking exactly the way a man like him was supposed to look: polished, confident, expensive. Vanessa walked the aisle on the arm of her father, radiant and triumphant, but I caught her eyes flicking toward Claire twice before she reached the front. The vows were standard, beautiful promises wrapped in beautiful language. I listened without reacting, and when it was over and the crowd applauded, I clapped politely and felt nothing. That surprised me. I had expected pain, or at least the echo of it. But there was just a kind of distance, like watching a movie about someone else's life. The reception was held in a garden behind the church, white tents, string lights, a live band that probably cost more than my car. The seating chart placed me at a table near the back, which was the first honest thing Vanessa had done all day. But even from the back of the room, Claire's presence sent ripples. People kept glancing our way. A man I didn't recognize stopped by to introduce himself and ended up talking to Claire about a development project in Austin for 15 minutes. She was polite, engaged, and completely at ease. I stood beside her and let the evening carry itself. And for the first time that day, I didn't feel like I was on display. Then Vanessa came to our table. She had a glass of champagne in her hand, and a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. She didn't acknowledge Claire directly at first. Instead, she looked at me with the kind of exaggerated pity that's designed to be witnessed by everyone nearby. "Noah, I'm so glad you stayed. I was worried this might be hard for you." Her voice was honey over glass. Then she turned to Claire, as if noticing her for the first time. "And who is this? I don't think we've met." Claire extended her hand with effortless composure. "Claire Whitmore. I'm here with Noah." Vanessa shook her hand, and I watched her process the name. It didn't register, not yet. She turned back to me and dropped her voice just low enough to create the illusion of privacy, though she knew perfectly well that the couples at the adjacent table could hear every syllable. "Really, Noah, you didn't have to bring someone to prove a point. It's a little desperate, don't you think?" She tilted her head with a sympathetic expression that made my jaw tighten. "Did you hire her for the evening, or is this something more creative?" Before I could answer, Grant appeared at Vanessa's side scotch, in hand, his smile broad and practiced. He had the easy confidence of a man who believed every room he entered was better for his presence. He looked at Claire with the kind of casual appraisal men like him apply to everyone, measuring value, calculating usefulness. "I don't think we've been introduced," he said, extending his hand. "Grant Holloway, the lucky groom." He laughed at his own joke. Claire shook his hand and held his gaze. Claire Whitmore. This time, the name landed differently. I watched Grant's expression go through a series of rapid adjustments, recognition, surprise, and then a careful rearrangement of his entire demeanor. His smile stayed, but it got sharper, more attentive. Claire Whitmore, he repeated slowly, like he was confirming something to himself. Whitmore Capital. Claire nodded once simply, as if confirming her coffee order. That's right. Grant turned to Vanessa, and for the first time all evening, I saw something genuine on his face. Urgency. Because I could see it. Now Grant had been trying to get a meeting with Claire's firm for months. She was the investor he couldn't reach the door, that wouldn't open the name that kept appearing on his wish list of backers for his latest development venture. And here she was, standing next to the man his new wife had turned into a punchline. Vanessa's eyes narrowed. I could see her placing the name, now she had heard Grant mention Whitmore Capital, before maybe over dinner, maybe on a phone call. She knew it mattered to him. But she hadn't understood how much, and the gap between what she knew and what she didn't was suddenly visible on her face like a crack in glass. She had married the image of Grant's success without ever learning the architecture behind it. Grant recovered quickly. He leaned toward Claire with renewed charm and started asking about her portfolio, her interest in the regional market, her thoughts on mixed-use developments. It was transparent and almost painful to watch the groom at his own wedding, abandoning the social script to pitch an investor he'd stumbled into by accident. Claire answered his questions with measured politeness, giving just enough to keep the conversation going, but never enough to commit to anything. She was in control, and everyone at that table knew it. Vanessa's face changed. The champagne smile was gone, replaced by something tighter, something I recognized from the last year of our marriage, the look she got when a situation slipped beyond her control. She grabbed my arm and pulled me a few steps away from the table, her grip harder than it needed to be. Her voice was low and coiled like a wire about to snap. What is this, Noah? You bring this woman here to embarrass me at my own wedding. Her eyes were searching my face for some sign of a scheme, a plan, a deliberate attack. I told her the truth. Claire was a friend. She came because I asked her to, that was all. But Vanessa didn't believe in that kind of simplicity. In her world, everything was a move. Every relationship was leverage, and no one did anything without calculating the return. So she pushed harder, her voice rising just enough to attract the attention of the guests at the nearest tables. You've always been pathetic, Noah, but this is a new low. You couldn't stand seeing me happy, so you found some rich woman to parade around like a trophy. Do you think anyone here is fooled? She wanted me to break. She wanted me to raise my voice to defend myself loudly, to create the kind of scene that would let her play the victim at her own wedding. I could feel the anger rising in my throat, like heat, and for a second, I almost gave her what she wanted. But then I looked past her and saw the faces at the surrounding tables not laughing anymore, not amused. They were watching Vanessa the way you watch someone who has gone too far and doesn't realize it yet. Her words were doing the work she had wanted mine to do. Every accusation, every sneer, every calculated insult was peeling back the polish and showing the room exactly who she was. Not a gracious bride, not a woman who had moved on, just someone who had built an entire wedding around the pleasure of humiliating the man she used to sleep next to. And the more she talked, the more obvious it became. Grant stepped in not to defend me, but to manage the damage. He put a hand on Vanessa's shoulder and whispered something sharp. She shook him off. Then she turned back to me with one last strike, her voice steady and deliberate, each word placed like a knife. You were nothing without her standing next to you. You were nothing when you were with me, and you're nothing now. The only difference is you found someone willing to pretend otherwise. The garden went quiet around our corner of the tent. I could hear the band playing something soft and distant, like music from another world. Vanessa stood there, breathing hard, waiting for me to crumble. Grant stood behind her, his face a mask of controlled fury, not at her, but at the situation. He was doing the math in his head how much of this had Claire Whitmore just witnessed, and how much of it would cost him. I stood still, my hands at my sides, and felt the weight of every word she had said settle on me like stones. She wasn't entirely wrong, that was the worst part. I wasn't rich, I wasn't powerful. Standing next to Claire, I probably did look like someone borrowing a life that wasn't his. But there was something Vanessa had missed, something she had always missed, because she measured people by what they hadn't, by what they chose. I was here. I had walked into her trap, knowing it was a trap, and I was still standing. Not because of Claire, not because of money, or status, or the right suit. Because I had decided that no one, not Vanessa, not Grant, not anyone in this garden got to define me by their applause or their contempt. But I hadn't said that yet. I was still standing in the wreckage of her words, and the whole room was waiting to see what I would do next. Claire stepped forward and stood beside me. She didn't touch my arm. She didn't speak on my behalf. She just stood there close enough that I could feel the steadiness coming off her, like heat from a wall that had been soaking in sunlight all day. And in that small gesture, just being there, just not leaving, she gave me something Vanessa never had room to think without being judged for the silence. Every instinct in my body was pulling in two directions. One wanted to tear back, to list every lie Vanessa had told during our marriage every night. She came home smelling like someone else's ambition every time she smiled at me in public and cut me apart in private. I had the ammunition, 7 years of it loaded and ready. The other instinct was quieter but stronger, like a deep current beneath rough water. It told me that the moment I opened my mouth to destroy her, I would become exactly the man she had described. A bitter ex-husband, a man who couldn't let go. And every person in that garden would remember me that way, no matter how justified the anger was. Claire looked at me, not with pity, not with expectation, just a clear, steady gaze that felt like being seen without being weighed. Then she said, quietly enough that only I could hear, "You don't need to prove anything to anyone here. You just need to choose who you want to be when you walk out of this place." It was a mirror held up at exactly the right angle, showing me the version of myself I had spent the last 14 months building, the man who ran in the mornings, who paid his bills on time, who rebuilt his life without asking anyone to applaud. That man didn't need to shout. That man didn't need to win. That man just needed to stay intact. I took a breath that went all the way to the bottom of my lungs. Then I turned to the faces around me, the guests at the nearest tables, who had stopped pretending not to listen, the bridesmaids frozen mid-step, the bartender, who had put down a bottle of wine to watch. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't point at Vanessa. I spoke the way you speak when you've already decided that these are the last words you'll ever waste on a chapter that should have ended a long time ago. "I came here today because I was invited," I said. "I came because I believed that showing up was the right thing to do. Not for Vanessa, not for Grant, but for myself. I wanted to close a door that I'd left open for too long, and I wanted to do it standing up, not hiding." I let that sit for a second before continuing. "I didn't come here to make a scene. I didn't come here to compete with anyone, or prove that I've moved on. I came here because I still believe that when someone invites you to their wedding, the decent thing to do is show up and wish them well, even when the invitation wasn't decent." Vanessa's lips parted like she was about to interrupt, but nothing came out. Grant had his hand on her elbow now, and whether he was holding her back or holding her up, I couldn't tell. "I wish you both peace," I said, looking at Vanessa directly for the first time without flinching. "I mean that. But I will not stand here and let anyone, not you, not anyone, use another person as entertainment. I'm not a prop. I'm not a punchline. And I'm not going to become cruel just because cruelty was offered to me. I straightened my jacket, the navy blue one that cost a fraction of anything else in that garden, and it felt like armor. That's all I came to say. No one clapped. No one gasped. The silence that followed was the kind that presses against your skin, heavy, almost physical. It was the silence of a room full of people who had just been forced to look at something real in the middle of something manufactured. Vanessa stared at me, and for a brief moment I saw something behind her eyes that I hadn't seen in years. Not anger, not contempt. Something closer to recognition, the kind that comes when you realize the person you dismissed has grown past the place where you left them. It disappeared fast. Her jaw tightened, and her posture stiffened, and whatever crack had appeared sealed itself shut. But I had seen it, and that was enough. Not because it gave me satisfaction, but because it confirmed something I had needed to know. She heard me. Whether she admitted it today, tomorrow, or never, she heard me. Grant leaned in and murmured something to Vanessa, his hand firm on her back, steering her away from our corner of the tent, like a handler moving a client away from a bad photo opportunity. He glanced at Claire one more time before they turned a look that was half calculation, half regret. He had spent the evening watching a potential investor witness his new wife unravel in public, and the cost of that was already being tallied behind his eyes. Whatever deal he had hoped to pitch, whatever door he had imagined Claire might open it, had closed the moment Vanessa started speaking. Claire touched my elbow lightly just once. "Let's go," she said. Not urgently, not dramatically, just the way someone says it when the evening is over, and there's nothing left worth staying for. We walked through the garden together, past the string lights and the white tents, and the band that had started playing again, as if nothing had happened. A few guests watched us leave. Most looked away, returning to their champagne and conversation with the practiced ease of people who were already deciding how to retell this story at brunch tomorrow. By the time we reached the edge of the parking lot, the music had faded to a thin sound behind us, like something playing on a radio in another room. The evening air hit my face, and I realized my hands were shaking. Not from fear, from the release of something I had been carrying for longer than I wanted to admit. It was the weight of caring, what Vanessa thought of me, the weight of wondering if she was right, the weight of believing that her version of my story might be the one that stuck. I let it go somewhere between the last tent pole and my car, and I felt lighter than I had in over a year. I stopped walking and turned to Claire. She stood a few steps behind me, the emerald of her dress catching the last light from the garden. She looked the same as she had when she walked through the church doors, calm, unhurried, entirely herself. She hadn't raised her voice once all evening. She hadn't dropped a single devastating insult. She hadn't waved her money or her status like a weapon. All she had done was show up, stand next to me, and refuse to be anything other than exactly who she was. And that had been enough to shift the entire balance of the room. Not because wealth is power, but because composure is. Because dignity, when it's real, doesn't need volume. "I don't need anyone to rescue me," I told her. "I want you to know that. I walked in there on my own decision, and I would have walked out on my own too." I meant it. Every word. Because the last thing I wanted was to trade one kind of dependency for another, to go from being the man Vanessa defined to being the man Claire saved. I had to own this night myself, or it meant nothing. Claire looked at me with an expression I can only describe as respect without sentimentality. "I know," she said. "I didn't come to rescue you, Noah. I came because I respect you. I have since that night at the restaurant, when you helped a stranger without asking what she could do for you in return. That's rare, and I wasn't going to let you walk into a room designed to make you forget that." We stood there for a moment, Two people who had both learned the hard way that the world doesn't always reward decency, but who had decided to practice it anyway. There was nothing romantic about the moment, nothing cinematic, just two human beings standing in a parking lot on a Saturday evening, breathing a little easier than they had an hour ago. I drove home with the windows down. The night air filled the car, and I turned the radio off because I didn't want noise. I wanted to hear the silence and know that it was mine. Not the loaded silence of that garden, not the suffocating silence of my marriage, but the clean silence of a man who had been tested and had chosen correctly. I didn't win tonight. Winning would mean I was playing Vanessa's game, and I had refused to sit at that table. What I did was something smaller and harder than winning. I stayed myself. When I got home, I hung the navy blue suit back in the closet and stood in my kitchen for a long time, looking at the place where Vanessa's invitation had sat on the counter for 3 days. The counter was empty now. I had thrown the card away before I left for the church, and the bare surface looked exactly right clean and unburdened, ready for whatever came next. I didn't know what that would be. I didn't need to. For the first time in 14 months, the future wasn't something I was bracing against. It was just the next morning, and then the one after that, and I would meet each one the same way, standing up, looking forward, answering to no one but the man in the mirror. Because here's what I learned that night, and what I hope stays with anyone who hears this. Don't use a crowd to tear someone down just to feed your own ego. Class isn't measured by who stands next to you. It's measured by how you treat the people who can no longer do anything for you. And sometimes, the greatest victory you'll ever have is walking away from a fight you could have won with everything that matters still intact.